I would like to welcome everyone to MTRI's 2022 Sit Back Seminar Series. Each month, we will be hosting a talk on the biodiversity and conservation of Guestbook, or Southwest Nova Scotia. So my name is Chad Simmons, and I'm an ecologist here at the Marcy Tobiatic Research Institute. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that MTRI is in and we are meeting from Guestbook, one of the 7 districts of Mi'kmaq, homeland of the Mi'kmaq people. We acknowledge the treaties of peace and friendship, and we thank the Mi'kmaq people for their generosity in sharing their homeland with us. So for anyone who is unaware, MTRI is a research-based nonprofit, and we are nestled in Southwest Nova Scotia near Kejimkujik National Park and Historic Site, and within the Southwest Nova Scotia Biosphere Reserve. Our mission is to promote, conserve, and sustain biodiversity in Guestbook as well as beyond. So tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Peter Bush. Peter is the Old Growth Forest Coordinator with the province, and tonight he'll be giving us an overview of the policy and answering your questions. I'm very happy to say that Peter and his department have been working with MTRI for almost a decade now, addressing the conservation of old growth forests, and it's a pleasure to have him tonight. So next, I'm going to hand the seminar over to you, Peter. But before that, I'd like to remind everyone to please keep your mics muted, and if you have any questions during the talk, you can type them into the chat window. We'll have a dedicated question period at the end for you to ask your questions live. So Peter, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Chad. It's a pleasure to be here. Very excited to be talking about old growth forests, especially with MTRI. It's been a long-standing partnership, so that's great. So here we go. How did we get here? I guess that's the first thing always people ask me. Well, it's been a fun and long journey. So we started back in '99 with an interim old forest policy. And who says government doesn't move fast? It only took more than 12 years to get that interim policy into a policy in 2012. And then some other things, of course, have happened along the way. There's been the Waller Lake, Loon Lake harvest that received a lot of publicity from CBC and concern from the public. And then, of course, there was a review of forestry practices. And in particular, there was a recommendation 17 that related to old growth conservation. So it's important before that we get to the review of forestry practices and how we ended up with this new policy is to remind myself and others that we're really building on previous discoveries. You know, there was lots of early work leading to that 2012 policy, years of research, hundreds of old forest scoring plots, lots of research plots where we cored every tree in the plot and snag. We engaged with academics. We talked with other jurisdictions, NGOs, Mi'kmaq partners, forest companies, a whole range of people. There was also, you know, a real foundational research done, literature publication on old growth forests in Nova Scotia by Bruce Stewart and et al. And I also want to mention that there was work done by Dalhousie University and Dr. Peter Dunker and students looking at biodiversity and landscape and social values of old growth. So this work was going on. We really started to build on this. But it really came to the forefront with the review of forestry practices. And so what the government did in response to a number of the recommendations of review of forestry practices was that they developed an old forest project team. So the first thing we did is we sort of contacted Peter Dunker to be our external expert, and we established a team then of a number of other experts, Dr. John Brazier, myself, Bruce Stewart, Matt Ritalik, Megan Pollock. There's been a number, Mark Pulsver, I think I saw him on the list there. And all of these people really helped, and you can see some real diversity in there in terms of we had foresters, we had biologists, we had planners, we had policy researchers and expert ornithologists. So we had a real range to really build this policy together from all aspects. And so part of that consultation leading to the new policy We did a number of sort of consultations on the way. It's a really multi-targeted approach. So we had staff consultations, we did targeted stakeholder consultations. And those are really conversations about sort of the old policy and what people wanted to see in the new policy. We met with the Minister's Advisory Committee, and there's a range of people on that committee as well, met with them at least twice. We met with other government departments, and I'm also mindful that my colleagues in Energy Mines actually used to be in a different department. They're now in our same department. My colleagues at Environment and Climate Change and Transportation was another government department we met with. We also met with Parks Canada as well. Of course, we had formal consultations with our Mi'kmaq partners, and we had public consultations, and we had 120 submissions. Now, for some of you, maybe do other types of consultations, maybe it doesn't seem like a lot, but it was a lot of thoughtful comments, written comments that really were helpful in forming the new policy. And at the time we had this draft policy out, Professor Leahy was also in the middle of doing his evaluation of what the government had done so far in terms of the response to review of forestry practices. And in his evaluation, he did also comment and add some additional comments about what was going on with the old forest policy. So some of the key things that we took from that consultation, we wrote in our consultation report, and there was 10 key themes that sort of popped up that people were across the province, our stakeholders, our Mi'kmaq partners were talking about. To put biodiversity goals first, we heard about concerns about removing old growth forest area, needing public input, and that was definitely one change that we made. We heard concerns about area targets. We had some concerns about the definition in multiple ways. We heard from Mi'kmaq. We heard from non-Mi'kmaq about needing Mi'kmaq partners and values in there. We can definitely see that reflective in the new policy. We heard about the difference between law and policy. And I think we addressed why we think there's an advantage to the policy as compared to law. We heard about private land. We heard about penalties. Penalties are allowed and can be and have been used on Crown land for area that is under protection under the old growth forest policy. So the penalties do exist, even though we didn't sort of identify it in the initial draft. We heard about concerns about counting or over counting in protected areas. So we addressed some of that, dropping more than 100,000 hectares of what was counted previously to what is counted now. We also heard about concerns about activities taking place near old growth. And we heard, again, a range of interests and concerns there. So as a result of all that consultation, we made many changes and we had a lot of clarity to the new draft policy. And so someone asked me, how much consultation did you do on the 2012 policy? And sheepishly, we said none. And so this was a big change and a move towards how government and our department is working towards ecological forestry. So the responses are detailed in the public and stakeholder consultation. I think that was included in the invite, if I'm not mistaken. And I can show you where that is located if it wasn't. So, hey, here's the policy. So the new old growth forest policy. The first thing that you're going to see is that there's a name change, and that is intentional. And the second I want to talk about is some of these key approaches. So overall, the policy really supports the approach to ecological forestry by prioritizing biodiversity for these uncommon and unique ecosystems. That's a foundation of the new paradigm that our department and government is under in forest management and conservation. And we can see this reflected in the policy. These areas on Crown land that the policy applies to will fit into the conservation zone of the triad approach, which is also part of the recommendation of the review of forestry practices. This new policy incorporates not only previous science, that happened over the last 10 years, but new science that has been happening sort of as we were doing consultation, and staff and local researchers and universities were doing that research. We engaged in local expertise and traditional knowledge. It also supports this longstanding approach by the province of Nova Scotia to do voluntary conservation on private land. And so not only that has been the approach, that's also exactly what we heard we want, that the private land owners wanted. And so that's overall approaches. So what are some key highlights? And then I'm going to go into some details, and of course there'll be lots of time for questions. So yes, there is that name change, and that is intentional. There was an old forest policy, and now this is called old growth. We really wanted the policy to focus on what was of highest concern to the citizens of Nova Scotia. Old growth, we heard it again and again, people using the term. And one of the things that I think we heard, that there was confusion of terms. So we wanted to focus on old growth, and we wanted to simplify the term so that there weren't 5 or 6 terms describing relatively the same thing. And so that was a focus. This next one is in bold. It's in bold for a reason. The policy has a very bold statement and a strong statement based on what we heard from the public, is that we conserve all old growth. So our target is 100%. The policy has a goal and objective to conserve all old growth forests. That's a pretty big statement. So we're excited about that. So further along, other key highlights were revise the definition to follow an ecologically based definition of late successional forest and age. So this was based on science, and I'm going to go into that a bit more. It's based on current forest ecosystem classification, identifying just late successional forest, just not something that's old. It needs to be late successional forest. Got rid of all the terms like climax forest and things like that. Focused on late successional. That's a key change. Clarified the definition of not including managed forests. I think that's an important thing that we heard from stakeholders as well. Other key highlights, before I get into some more specifics, there's stronger language about any removal of policy and any compensation related for any old growth removals. There's stronger language for supporting private conservation. And although, there's no direct action, sometimes strong language is really important in a policy because it gives direction to government, to staff to do that work. And that can be very important and a very important role in policy. There's strong reporting and renewal language. So there was no renewal language in the previous policies. There was limited reporting. And so there's strong statements about that. And so those are some key highlights and changes. Now, there's lots of detailed people on the call, so let's get into some of the details. Old growth forest areas. We define old growth forest areas based on old growth ages and has been estimated to meet this minimum age of onset of old growth attributes. So what do I mean by that? It means as a forest starts to become old, it starts to have those characteristics that we're used to seeing, things like dead snags or coarse woody debris, fallen dead trees. We see the age structure or the canopy or multi-age structure starting to develop. We see some canopy openings. That's what I mean, the age that we see, those onset of those old growth attributes. When we dived into it with some of our research and our research plots, those old growth attributes really started to jump out when we were looking at the 20% basal area of trees. It's that when we looked at the trees having, having trees at that larger age and at the top 20 percentile is when we really seeded those old growth conditions jumping in. So the definition also includes that forest is defined as areas greater than 1 hectare. We need to separate out what is a tree, or one or two or three trees, from what is a forest. And so we needed to put a definition. We looked long and hard to see if there was a scientific definition of what is the size of a forest, and there wasn't one, right? And so what we thought was what was the smallest area that we could legitimately say is a forest, and we came up with 1 hectare. And that was also based on the forest inventory minimal mappable unit. In other words, the minimum size that they call in the photo inventory, the photo interpreted GIS layer, what they call a stand, based on looking at it from 10,000 feet and looking at the delineating areas of similar stands of forest. So that's the 1 hectare. Remember, 1 hectare, and someone will probably correct my math here, but it's only about 70 meters in radius. So it's a relatively small area, 100 meters by 100 meters, and that's the size that we went down to. So a much smaller size. So the definition of old growth is also based on FEC. So many of you will be familiar with the forest ecosystem classification. This is an ecosystem-based approach to classifying our forests. It's more holistic. It's not just based on sort of timber values. It's taken a look at not only the trees, but the lower vegetation, the soils, the site classification. All of that is considered. So we focus on the vegetation types of the forest ecosystem classification, and then assign the age of onset for each of those forest types. So we start with forest groups. For those familiar with the FEC, I'm sorry for those but basically we have broad categories of forests, and then we have very specific vegetation types within that. So for example, we have tolerant hardwood forests, and then we have more specifically the TH1, TH2 are our sugar maples, and then we get to yellow birches and red oak and red maple, tolerant hardwood stands in there. And so we set specific ages for different types. And the ages ranges based on what we intuitively know and what we found from our review of our literature, our comparison, our research, is that these forests become old at different ages, right? So maybe intuitively, some of us know that balsam fir will not live as long as eastern hemlock, right? And so it's logical to think that balsam fir becomes old growth sooner than eastern hemlock. And so some of this work was built on recent research. For example, the coastal black spruce was work done by Emily Woodstraw at the University of New Brunswick. And without her research, we probably wouldn't have been able to come up with at that age, or even been very confident that coastal black spruce is actually old growth. Some people viewed it as more even age forests and didn't have old growth characteristics. But some of that research just published or defended in 2020 really helped identify that. We had work done by Megan Pollock on tolerant hardwood. We had work done by the department in red oak. And we really tried to understand these forest groups before we signed the age. And we also looked at what other jurisdictions were doing. It is based partly on the age, the maximum age those trees can grow. And then it's also based on what research is saying when we started there. Interestingly enough, some of the initial research out of the Acadian forest really pegged old growth at 150 years, and we're below that, Mosler et al. Sort of report. And those are the ages. So one clear thing I want to sort of talk about in the old growth policy, the old growth policy only it looks at sort of two clear sort of definitions, right? It looks at old growth, which I just talked about. And then there's other areas that are called old growth forest opportunity areas. And so these are areas that are near old growth. They might be 110 years old. They might be 115 or 120, right? If they're hemlock. So they're near old growth. They're in that old growth type generally. Okay. we have set aside some of these near old growth, called old growth restoration opportunities on Crown land, but we also measure and try to understand what near old growth or likely old growth is in protected areas. So we haven't measured all of the forests in protected areas. For example, I just 2 weeks ago, I was at Hemlock and Hardwood Trails, at many trail, probably the most famous old growth in the province. That shows up as restoration opportunity. Everyone probably knows it's old growth, but literally we haven't measured it, meaning our department hasn't measured it. We don't have an accurate age, exactly how old that stand is. And so it's still called a restoration opportunity, even though we know that some of it is old growth. So age is a bit hard to tell across these broad areas, but we know that this area has been set aside and it will become old growth if it's not old growth now, in the near future. So those are old growth restoration opportunities. So as we come to other discussions, remember that there is this distinction between, we can say the word true old growth or old growth, and old growth restoration opportunities. I'm going to pause for a second there. Thank you. Take a look at my time. Doing pretty good. Another key thing that this new old growth policy does is it adds some clarification to the definition of old growth for managed stands. We heard from the public that there was concerns about, quote, managing stands into old growth, or having stands called old growth when there's been a lot of sort of forest management in there. We took inspiration from literature that talked about, a simple definition of old growth is that old growth is relatively old and relatively undisturbed. And so we had to try to get relatively old. We just talked about those ages by different forest types, right? So we operationalized or sort of tackled that relatively old part, but we also had to tackle the relatively undisturbed or relatively little human disturbance. So what we did is we looked at what were some of the disturbances, human caused, and we've kind of focused on timber management or silviculture treatment. We used the year instead of sort of going 30 years in a rotational sort of 30 years. We used the year saying anything that has had recent silviculture treatment, we defined recent as 1990, and then that will not be considered old growth. So if there was a shelterwood harvest, or there was a patch cut, or there was a clear cut, or there was a single tree selection or commercial thin, that stand is not old growth. And it's fair to say that silviculture treatment has changed the trajectory of that stand and removed some of the key attributes of old growth forests. So it could still be incredibly important, incredibly valuable for biodiversity. And we acknowledge that. We're just saying that it's not old growth. It could be put in as if there's other biodiversity values there, if there's species at risk, if there is uncommon lichens or rare lichens, we could still put that treated forest, or uncommon birds, we could still put that treated forest. Maybe it's a single tree selection 20 years ago. We could still put it under long-term conservation protection under the old forest policy, old growth policy, as a restoration. We just don't automatically call it old growth. There is stronger language in this policy about the removal of any old growth. So I want to start off by saying removal in the policy can only happen in rare and exceptional circumstances. I think there were people on our team to say, if it's only rare and exceptional circumstances, why even mention it? Well, because it can happen. And government might need that clarity or want to talk clearly about if there is a rare and exceptional circumstance that they want to be removed. Well, what is a rare and exceptional circumstances? So I can give you some examples, but really it's the public that determines it, and in particular, the minister and the political system that we work. So this was a change from the draft policy, is that the minister now requires the removal of any old growth area, and it will only be done in rare and exceptional circumstances. And it has to meet that test of it's in the public good, right? So this would not be for forest management for wood supply or a wood supply logging road. These are provincial interests. So if I was to give one example, the twinning of a highway saves lives. The minister could make that case, would go to the public, would also go to former consultation with Mi'kmaq about that removal before that decision made. If that decision is made by the minister would require compensation from 5 to 10 times. And so that's all old growth area in replace of that old growth. So for example, if 2 hectares is removed for that highway, then at least 10 or 20 hectares of old growth needs to be added. And that needs to come from not from Crown land, but from private land. Well, why from private land? Because all old growth area is protected, whether we know or it's not. So that would not be added if we just added more Crown land. So even if the government is a proponent, the government would need to buy, as part of that highway development, new old growth on private land. And there is some, and I've seen some, and I know where it is. And so we would buy that as compensation. We took a lot of inspiration from the wetland policy, but it is a very high bar, and it is meant to be a high bar intentionally to support that it only happens in rare circumstances. There can be removals from restoration areas. It's still also only in exceptional circumstances. Again, so not for wood supply and not for a logging road, for those highways or major infrastructures that are a public good. Because these are restoration areas, they're not old growth. They can be replaced by other near old growth. Something 115, 120 years old could be replaced. So that's at the ED. Sorry, my government acronyms at the executive director. So that's just a little bit below the minister. And there'd be no public consultation, sort of formal public consultation on those. Okay. So that was a big one. That was definitely a change. So the policy maintains all existing, so I talked about previous policies, all the areas set aside on those policies are protected under this policy, all that Crown land. Again, the policy does not apply for protected areas. We are simply accounting in protected areas. But on the Crown land, when I say Crown land, I mean outside of protected areas, all existing, so anything that was set aside. And here, an interesting example, some stuff that we've set aside for old growth forest back in 1990 and 2010 or 2012 included the most recent addition to Blue Mountain Birch Cove. The area that the Nature Trust was trying to connect between those two adjacent parts, two disjunct parts? Well, the one further, make sure my directions, west, was actually old forest policy land first, right? It was set aside because it had mature forest on it. And so sometimes these will become protected areas, legally protected areas, and other times they remain in sort of this policy protection. Okay? So new old growth areas will be added as they're discovered. These are kind of the unknowns. How do we find them? Well, we have staff going out. Sometimes we have MTRI looking. Sometimes we have other people looking, including licensees. One of the licensees, Port Hawkesbury Paper, in the last 3 or 4 years have added 300 or 400 hectares. They found themselves by their staff and have been added to old growth policy protection. And so those areas are now protected under the policy and are required to do that as they look. We can also, the policy allows for additional areas. So I mentioned that if there's something, there's a light touch forest management, we can still add that if there is, a shortage in an area, which is how do we know there's shortage there? That's why we look at protected area, just to see where there's shortages, right? Other biodiversity values, other cultural values, and Mi'kmaq values as well. Okay, oops. Private land conservation. I know a number of you are going to be interested in private land conservation for sure. So what the policy does is it commits the department to work with organizations and groups to explore mechanisms to support and encourage conservation on old growth. Working on a very exciting project with some UNB students right now, some master's students, exploring those mechanisms. I have some conversations coming up in the next week or two with some local organizations to see what some better mechanisms are, whether that's carbon, whether it's other types of tax incentives, whether it's other ways to encourage conservation on private land. So stay tuned. There is a commitment that we share those other mechanisms within the next year. So I'm encouraging those UNB students to get working. We're also going to work with sort of, help encourage third-party forest certifications. We definitely heard in our consultations that is a motivation for some landowners and for some companies. Another part of working with private land is making documentation and workshops available, and we're sort of committed to that. We're already sort of started on better documentation and providing, and I think today is part of that sort of communication for sure. We're also going to work with trying to identify ways of reporting, right? Sort of almost accounting what's going on private land. So I think that's an important part of understanding that. We also heard from a number of people that the importance of having recreation and learning opportunities for old growth. So we're going to work on this. We already started conversations with the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. In fact, one of my staff has, I think, 3 sessions next week or the following week at a junior high school talking about old growth and measuring old growth. We're going to be developing resources and training materials for indoors and outdoors. Our resources will include interpretations for Nuktamik and two-eyed seeing, and we're going to develop descriptive materials. We have posted now our story maps. We're also committed to sort of this reporting. Talked about that a bit before. The policy we renewed in 5 years. There was lots of discussion and debate about this, surprisingly. And I think 5 years is a really good time because it's an opportunity to not go too long, like maybe the previous policies were, and get that change as new science sort of comes in. And I think that's important. So a couple of final closing statements and save lots of time for questions here. The policy layer commits 25,000 hectares of old growth, near old growth restoration opportunities. And some of that is likely old growth. We just haven't measured it yet. It was set aside in some large blocks a number of years ago, and they put them in blocks because those are better areas to build forests, old growth forests around. And so, but we do know we've measured over 4,000 hectares of old growth forest on Crown land. So this is all outside of protected areas. And all of these areas have many biodiversity co-benefits. So these species are using these lands that are set aside for long-term conservation. And then sometimes while you're doing this work, you find something that makes it all worthwhile, that makes it very special. So there's some colleagues there, Daphna and Emily and Megan, and that is the oldest tree in Nova Scotia. So there was a CBC report on that. There's a link there. Probably if you Google CBC and oldest tree in Nova Scotia, you'll find that. It's actually the oldest tree in the Maritimes, verified by Mount Allison University, Ben Phillips, 532-year-old hemlock. And there's some of the rings, and you can see how tight they are, and the need for diligence and in order to do that counting. And that tree was surprisingly not the biggest tree in the stand. It was about 51, 52 centimeters in diameter. But it really sort of hung out. I think you saw that the rings were a little tight at the beginning. It's like it hung out in the understory for a bit and then jumped up, and we saw some sort of wider growth kind of in the middle. And then it's slowed down a bit and kind of hunkered below all the sort of the turbulence at the top. And it was about a few meters below the top of some of the tallest trees. So an exciting find. It's actually a great backstory that this forest area was set aside initially by Bowater when it was their own land and under their own old forest sort of policy. They set aside a number of lands for the purpose of conservation. They were thinking about triad then, and they set aside a number of areas. There's some not too far from Mersey Tobiatic Research Institute, just down the road. They set some of those lands aside, and including this one, just a little east of Panook Lake. And it was when government bought the land from Bowater, we eventually moved this into the old forest policy. So the oldest tree in Nova Scotia is policy protected by the old growth forest policy moving forward long term. So a sort of good story there. Just finishing up here with where the information can be found. There's the link. You can simply Google Nova Scotia Ecological Forestry. It'll take you there. There's the department website. It's got a little more information, some research reports, so on. Notice the picture there. It's got coral lichen on it. It's another one of the additions that we made in response to the public comments. Coral lichens and pit and mound topography are now part of our old forest scoring protocol. Coral lichen, all lichens are difficult to identify. Coral lichens, I'm starting to get better at them through working with some of my colleagues. And it's a good indicator that a stand is kind of more old growthy. And so it gives us another one of those things, coarse woody debris, large diameter trees. This is another indicator that we've incorporated in our scoring. So my last slide, Chad, I promise, and maybe a closing slide. Again, this is me saying this, of course, because I was involved in the writing of this, that I do think that Nova Scotia's old growth policy is a best-in-class policy or legislation for conservation of old growth forests. We had people do jurisdictional review, and I think there's some confidence in saying that this is a very strong policy and matches up very well against any policy in the country or legislation in the country. The policy supports Nova Scotians' strong desire to conserve this rare ecosystem. And on that note, there's some of my colleagues, Scott, Brad, Emily, and Morgan, who are all very helpful in developing this policy, as well as the Old Forest Project team. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's exciting to see all your hard work coming into fruition. Okay, so I know people have a lot of questions, and I thought we would start this question period by just giving anyone the opportunity that wants to ask a live question to Peter to do it. And if not, we can start going through the chat and the questions that were submitted to me ahead of time. I see Ben has his hand raised.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. I do really applaud the strong language that requires offsetting. Excuse the term, I know it's not in the policy, but that's kind of how I understood it, of old growth areas on private land by 5 to 10-fold if it needs to be removed from protection under exceptional circumstances. But my question in your presentation, excuse me if I have this wrong, but I'm wondering if you see any concerns with providing the ultimate discretion to the minister for determining what might be in the public interest as, part of how to determine if it's an exceptional circumstance for those old growth forests restoration opportunity areas, which it looks like currently outnumbers the old growth forest has actually been measured by, 5-fold. And the reason why I'm asking that question is because it didn't seem like those restoration opportunity areas, if they were to be removed, require public consultation prior to removal. Is that correct in my understanding?
Yes, there's a few things there, so I'll try to tackle them. And if I miss them, you'll have a chance to sort of ask again. So first, yes, there is, I think I'll cover it from the back end. So yes, the minister does make the decision on old growth areas. And it's the executive director that makes decision on restoration opportunities. But I will say that the restoration opportunity would have to be determined not to be old growth in order to follow that path. So the fact that we don't know that it's old growth, it can't be removed in those rare and exceptional circumstances. And again, it's not forestry that it will be removed for. It's not hurricane damage. It is because there's a major public interest, and they would need to be field identified beforehand to make sure that they're not old growth in order to follow that path. So hopefully that adds some clarification. Is there concern about with the minister? I think in our political system, our minister has a lot of authorities, even under legislation, to add or move or change any number of things related to resource management. This is consistent with that. I'll note that work or removals of protected areas is just one level above that at the cabinet, in which the minister is usually the one making the decision. It's also fair to say that if the minister would not make a decision of high importance without consulting their cabinet. And so this could very well be a cabinet decision, even though the policy doesn't require it. And the minister is supposed to listen to the public comments. And that's part of our political process.
Okay, great. Thank you.
James is next.
Hi, Peter. Just on that same subject of developments that might be considered being considered for compensation. You mentioned highways and stuff like that. Do you know? Can you think of any other things that might qualify as well? And I'm just concerned about wind farms.
Yeah, so the policy did not create an extensive list, in part because I really do think it's whatever that development is, it needs to meet the test of public interest. And part of that test is hearing from the public about the concerns in either way. And having Mi'kmaq consultation. So I don't want to speculate whether wind farms are or not. It seems to be a higher value than a particular forest operation or a logging road. But I'm not sure that it is, and I think it would be definitely an interesting test to see if that is. And of course, in all of these, we should be encouraging, and we are, and as an old growth coordinator, I would be encouraging avoidance in all cases whenever possible. Is there opportunities on private land? Is there opportunities on the other hill or further down the road that isn't old growth? And so it should always be avoidance. And so I think wind farms, although it's higher, I think there are opportunities for avoidance in some of those cases where a twinning of a highway, there may not be an alternative to go around Antigonish.
Yeah. Thanks.
Sorry, I'm not seeing the chat. You're going to monitor that chat, right? Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So we're getting a lot of questions. People are acknowledging that most of Nova Scotia is privately owned, and this policy doesn't. It starts to tackle that issue, and I'm wondering if you can just reiterate what the policy is stating about old growth forest on private lands, and maybe where the government's hoping to go in the next version of this policy.
Yeah, sure. I just want to be clear. The policy applies to Crown land, and under the Crown Lands Act, Crown land means area outside of protected areas. The only place the policy applies. Even though we do accounting in protected areas, it doesn't apply. It also does not apply on private land. We heard loud and clear from many private woodland owners that volunteer conservation was, and working with the government was the way that they preferred. And so we continue to that to try to achieve the outcome of meeting old growth conservation. And I think old growth conservation on private land can be a little more, do I want to say flexible, and that maybe, quote, some of that conservation includes some worked land, maybe some light touch forestry, because it might still meet that. If you look at the language there, it's slightly different. And I think some of the mechanisms that we're working on will be more nuanced than just buying the land. Having said that, proud to announce we received federal funding to buy just under $1 million for the next 5 years of old growth forests to help achieve that target. And it's all new old growth land on private land that the government's going to be buying. So that's one mechanism. Of course, prices of land these days, it's not going to go that far. But having said that, it's an important step, and we're looking at those other mechanisms. So I don't see any stick mechanisms in this policy. And that's what we heard from the public, and that's what we're going to continue to work on, working with private landowners.
Okay. Does anyone have any other questions they want to ask Peter? Okay, we have questions about hemlock woolly adelgid. It's likely we know that most of our old growth forests are hemlock dominated. We know that HWA is a big threat to hemlock trees. Does the government have any plans to kind of tackle the situation of those declining forests and replace them or treat them?
Yeah, so government is working hard on this. We're partnering with our federal colleagues and with private individuals. Part of that federal funding is also to help support hemlock woolly adelgid treatment of targeted hemlock stands on Crown land and some on private. So this includes some of our protected areas, some of our Crown land, old growth areas. I also want to say that not all of our old growth is in hemlock. Some of our most important is, but it might be more like 10%. I don't have that exact number, but it's not all, not even half, not even a quarter. So we have a lot of old growth, and the policy intentionally has old growth in different types of areas, right? So on drumlins, on valleys, in hummock areas, and we have a range of types, and that was part of the initial selection. And so this new policy also identifies old growth on some of the non-quote sexy old growth, meaning coastal black spruce, and those are important too. And so we are doing active management to try to tackle that. We're continuing to add old growth as we find it, right? And so those are our main sort of approaches. Active attack, and then continue to add to the pool of old growth that is, not hemlock as well. I have colleagues that are on that file. We're looking at different types of treatments, meaning different chemical approaches, and biological control. So our department is working very hard on that. from our forest health group as well. And I don't know if anyone's from our forest health group is on here, but we're definitely very active in that. Yes. Great. Next question.
Okay, so we have some questions coming in over Facebook. So in a situation where the government would have to replace some old growth forest that has been taken out of the policy and they go to private land to replace it, what's the plan of going about? Like, is it voluntary? Will there be financial compensation to the landowner? What's the general plan around that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The proponent will buy it. And the proponent will either be someone that is asking for that to happen and or government. So it will be purchased land. 100% purchase, no forced, right? For that rare and exceptional circumstances that old growth will be replaced.
Has there been any specific goals for how much forest should be protected under the policy?
All old growth, all of it.
All.
The answer is all.
Okay, so to my knowledge, from the questions I am looking at, and there's a lot of them to sift through, I think you have generally answered a lot of the questions, Peter. If anyone disagrees, now is the time to speak up.
I'd like to.
Hey, David.
I definitely disagree. And Peter knows because I've been talking about these issues with him, and he told me about 2 seminars, a way to bring it up. So I'll start with my rhetorical question. I think Bev Wigney also had some quite significant questions she wanted to ask. But anyway, I'll start with my rhetorical question. We know that Nova Scotia is a very windy province.
Yep.
We know that we've had a lot of trees blow down. Those tend to be old trees. And so my rhetorical question is, if an old growth forest blows down, is it still old growth? And how do you incorporate those old growth processes in your whole conservation scheme? Because I find it a little bit not very comprehensively minded in the parts that talk about when you can take parcels out of old growth, that you refer to blowdowns and you only talk about removing them. When in fact, if we look at old growth processes in Nova Scotia, they're dependent on, to some, a lot of our old growth is built on previous old growth. So, Peter, I've raised this question in detail with you. It's also posted in detail on the Facebook page, and I'm a bit surprised that you said all the questions were asked.
I didn't say that.
I've really been asking. I'd also just
David, I didn't say that, David.
Yeah.
I didn't say that. Okay, so let me start by asking your rhetorical question, and then I'll or not rhetorical, how I philosophically or scientifically believe, and then I'll talk about the policy, because I think they are somewhat different. Yeah. So a forest goes through cycle. Is old growth its end stage? I'm not sure I fully believe that, but an old growth that is fully built down does not have all the same old growth characteristics that are important for species and biodiversity. We think back to the goal of the policy, and the goal of conservation of old growth is that it has unique species there. It's one of the things, right? There's lots of other things that are important there. So those sites do have what I call ecological continuity, which means they've been there for a long time. So I think from a habitat perspective, from a species, it's no longer old growth, but from a unique system perspective, it has ecological continuity. Now, how does the policy deal with it? All of those old growth areas are intended to, if the stand blows down, is to remain there. These are like protected areas. So I've been out and I've surveyed some of this. We've lost some old growth in Nova Scotia, I'm sorry to report, because of Fiona. Some of that was in protected areas, Calvary Brook, just outside of Truro, Riversdale area, right? A whole side. I took a former minister there to see old growth. The whole side of the valley has blown down. We've lost that, quote, old growth. right? Are we going in to salvage harvest that and remove that? No, we're not. One, it's a protected area. There's an area further down the road from that, which we went and did training on old growth. It mostly blew down. It might be more 80% blown down. That's not being removed either. The statement about removal is only if, and the best example for those in the Halifax area is the Porter Lake fire after Hurricane Juan. That, yes, it was started by humans or kids, but the fuel load was built up because of that. And so we were just giving the minister space that if there is property and lives at human risk is at that he can remove that. That is the only reason to move. We are not removing, and I've made this clear to the department that old growth areas are not part of any salvage logging. They're not to be removed for wood supply. All of the old growth areas, restoration or old growth areas, it's not for salvage logging for wood supply. It would be removal for human life and property safety. That's it.
Okay,
And so they are,
I appreciate that clarification. I really do. I wish it was more explicit in the policy. But it's well known that historically a lot of those blowdowns were followed by fire.
Yeah.
So I would expect that we're going to have a lot of fire hazards from a lot of those areas that have blown down. So I'm just saying, just looking at this larger issue, would you consider prescribed fires in some of those places, which would replicate the old growth processes? Have you thought about that?
Yeah. So that I didn't think about your question that way, David. So I'm glad you asked. That's a great thing about a conversation instead of an email or Facebook post. Is that I think that's a possibility, and I would say that we thought of restoration in a very passive sense, and I think we use that term. I don't know if Peter Dunker, I think I saw him here, but I think we included that language. Is that we didn't approach restoration as active, but as passive, just the passage of time, which in part what you were thinking about, I think, in some of those, blowdowns. And not every stand is going to be 100% blowdown, right? So prescribed fires, I think it's possible. That is one, I would say it is possible, but it wasn't really a target of ours. So we were thinking restoration as passive, to set aside.
Okay, if you allow me, I'll ask one more related question so I get out of people's way. This question, the 140-year age, you know why that bothers me? Because we have so many stands in Nova Scotia that were blown down approximately 140 years ago or something close to that. So that, and that's kind of part of the natural cycle here. That's why I'm concerned about these wind processes. A lot of our forests are relatively short-lived because of these cycles. And so my concern is that by increasing that age from 125 to 140, that you're cutting out, and I've showed you you've seen the data, I've taken your own data and looked at it, the whole suite of stands and stuff are going to be eliminated by increasing that age to 140. So you're talking about all these changes you've made to old growth forest, but I'm also seeing it taken away from stands that are legitimately old growth. So I would just like to hear some response to that. And I really wish, Peter, I'll say this in public. I wish to me, this is just an academic thing. There's no personal antagonism in this, particularly with you. We know each other quite well. And I really wish that we could have had some of these discussions in the lead up to the old growth forest policy rather than when it's all done. But anyway, I'll just make that comment for the moment, and then now I'll be quiet.
Thanks, Dave. And so I think there is a question of scale, and I think the policy is focusing on things at a broader scale. I think the examples that you use for my data is one site that did have that, and I think that the old growth policy, the old growth forest policy, is working in combination or in concert with protected areas, and some of those areas, not all of those areas that experienced that hurricane damage 140 years ago, not all of them would have been blown down completely. And so some of those trees, it's not fair to say that those stands wouldn't necessarily score out. Some of those are going to be protected areas. And so that's part of it. And I think there is, again, we've used a scientific basis to define old growth. And I think there's some strength to that. It doesn't mean that those stands that you're talking about could still be added and can still be protected. And they could still be part of our protected area strategy, in which we're going to move to 50% of our crown land as protected. And I think that's a great area to focus on. If there's areas that quite aren't old growth that we want in conservation, they can be targets for our broader conservation goals. Old growth policy is just one of the many things. We got species at risk, we got protected areas target, we got so on, invasive species management, right? So these are all things that we need to sort of deal with. So sorry, I know we're running out of time chatting. I got to see a few more hands there. So,
that's all right. If you're okay, Peter, to keep going.
Yeah,
I do want to clarify to the audience that there have been a lot of questions submitted, way more than we can get to in an hour period. So I have consolidated them into main points and haven't gotten to every single question because there's a lot of what I would call nitty gritty. And if anyone wants those questions answered in more detail than we can do here tonight, please reach out to me. I will put my email in all of our comments and on our streams so you can easily reach me, and I will get you in contact with Peter. But I see James has his hand up next. So James, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention to Peter the whole business of what he's calling old growth and it seems to me that you're including a lot of things that traditional ecologists over the last century would not call old growth, Peter. The concept as it was developed by early ecologists such as Clements was that old growth forests replace themselves continually and that they're adapted to a certain soil and microclimate condition that is ongoing. Whereas he also had a concept of disturbance climax, where forest stands would grow up to a certain point, but they couldn't exceed them because either the soil was too shallow or too wet, or the exposure from being on hilltops was too high. And it seems to me that you've included all of those disturbance climax situations in your definition of old growth. Whereas I think what most Nova Scotians who are worried about old growth would consider would be the true zonal climax associations that grow on mesic fertile ground.
right. So, James, just because I know there's a number of other questions I want people to get to ask them. So I think the thinking about what we call old growth has evolved. We heard from the public, they wanted more. And I think that those are what you call traditional old growth types are included. We've included what other ecologists and foresters feel are old growth according to definite. So we can agree to disagree, but I think that adding more old growth types is better for the conservation of forest communities. So we have not excluded any traditional old growth areas. We've only added more that we think are late successional forests that are worth conservation.
Great. Now, I quite agree with you that there are many forest types in there that should be protected from logging. In fact, I would notice that half of the vegetation types that you have included as old growth are on wetland habitats that should not be logged at all?
Yeah, so that's
Go
a good.
figure.
So, yeah, so fair enough, James. The policy does not just apply to forestry; it also applies to development, right? And so that wind farm, that I can't remember who was asking about that. Maybe it was you. Not defining wetland old growth forest would allow that wind farm to occur on wetland old growth forest. The fact that we've defined it in this policy actually adds to better protection of all old growth and not just the upland types. So I think that's a good place to leave that question. And James, love to hear and chat with you more about that. But I see
One last
John,
one.
Peter Dunker.
No, we're going to move on to the next person,
Okay.
John.
Oh,
Thank
sorry.
you.
Thank you, James.
Thanks very much. Peter, you referenced the addition of reporting and renewal, and I agree with you that that's an excellent addition. The strength of the commitment, I guess, is of concern to me. I look at the Togiatic Wilderness Plan. There are significant requirements on the province in terms of reporting, other activities, and renewal. None, I think I can say safely, none or virtually none have been done, and it's already through more than one or two cycles. So how can how can we be assured that that there's something going to happen here?
Yeah, so it's an interesting point, John, that you make, that just because something is in legislation doesn't mean that it happens any more than it would happen in policy. So that's a requirement under the Wilderness Area Protection Act to do the plan. We only have one plan for our wilderness areas. And so the fact that it's in legislation doesn't necessarily mean that it happens. And so, I guess you have my commitment, and you can hold politicians accountable for it, and staff. And I think what we're trying to be is we're trying to be more open, and staff being more public facing, so that you can ask them those tough questions. Where's that report?
Great. Peter?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I just wanted to make a response to David Papaquin's suggestion that prescribed fire be considered as a tool for the management of particular forest ecosystems. I've been following prescribed fire since I was a forest firefighter in the 1970s. Across Canada, I've been following how prescribed fire pans out. There is absolutely zero public appetite for prescribed fire anywhere in Canada. And whenever the professional foresters who adore the technique give it a try, it goes awry. And so we can put to bed any concept of prescribed fire, especially in a place like Nova Scotia.
Okay. Well, with that, thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. It was a very interesting discussion, as always. So with that, I would like to thank the Region of Queens for supporting us and our seminar series. And as always, you can stay up to date with our seminars by following MTRI on Facebook. And if you'd like to watch tonight's talk again, you can check us out. You can check out our Facebook live streams or visit our YouTube channel. So with that, we want to thank you all once again, and hope that everyone stays well, and we get to see you all again very soon.